Welcome, everyone. I am Matt Rutherford, Curator of Genealogy and Local History at the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Author program with Francesca Morgan for her new book, A Nation of Descendants, Politics and the Practice of Genealogy in U.S. History. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry reading rooms and exhibition galleries are open to readers Tuesday through Saturday. Our Rosenberg bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday, and you can shop online at any time. You can purchase A Nation of Descendants there. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online classes, and our virtual and in-person public programs. I also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and present. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Francesca Morgan, Associate Professor of History at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, and author of Women and Patriotism in Jim Crow America. She is also a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library and did much of her extensive research for Nation of Descendants here. So it's great to see you, Francesca. Welcome.
You too, Matt.
Thank you, and congratulations on publishing such a marvelous work. I have it here in front of me.
Well,
it's really,
I do too.
That's great. It's fascinating the way you've laid out the history of genealogy in America. It truly is.
Thank you.
Your book covers a lot of ground and a broad chronological scope, really from the 18th through the 21st centuries to today. And there are many, many directions we can go, but to start off, let's start at the top. Your subtitle is The Politics and Practice of Genealogy in U.S. History. And as genealogists and in genealogy in general, we tend to talk a lot about the practice of genealogy to the point that most of us don't even consider any of its other aspects. But the fascinating lens that you introduce is politics. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the politics of genealogy? How has genealogy been political?
Well, thanks, Matt. I appreciate the question. When I use the term politics, I mean politics in its broadest sense. Our term politics comes from the term for power relations. I mean social hierarchies of all kind, and I also take into account institutions of government. And I'm going to get even broader. A big point of mine is genealogy expressing group identity. It may seem very personal. It may seem about particular individuals, families, surnames, but there are all kinds of ways that it reinforces and perpetuates and even creates all kinds of other social hierarchies and challenges them too. We've seen it be an instrument of white supremacy, if you will, and that's complicated in itself. We've also seen it express the freedom struggles and the push for civil rights. And I could go on, but I will welcome Matt's next question to make the most of our time.
Well, absolutely, and that you spend quite a bit of the thrust of the book is exactly about these hierarchies, and they're really fascinating. And you really show us that there are many twists and turns in the history of genealogy and many inflection points. And one big one that I really want to talk about, and that I think is likely familiar to our audience, Alex Haley's roots is seen by many as a seminal point in the practice of American genealogy. Your book argues that it both transformed genealogy practice and also perpetuated some of these hierarchies that you just alluded to that have been present throughout American history. So can you spend a minute and describe Roots and some of the changes that it wrought?
Absolutely. Let me give you all a quick overview that will, for some of you, serve as a reminder. Alex Haley was already famous as the author of the autobiography of Malcolm X when he published the book Roots in late 1976, after about 4 years of many articles and talks. In a nutshell, Roots is his account of 7 generations of his mother's ancestry going back to an enslaved ancestor, an enslaved forefather who had known Africa, what is today the nation of Gambia, acknowledging the Mandinka tribe. And so the story starts with Kunta Kinte, childhood and youth in Africa, and extends to his enslaved descendants in British America and then in the USA, and goes on to discuss emancipated ancestors. And this is a story where the principal characters and heroes, this is a story of heroes and villains, and the heroes here are African American. And 4 months after this best-selling book came out, Alex Haley called it a saga, an adventure story. We have the 8-part, I'm going to call it a mini-series, even though at the time we didn't use the word mini-series. It showed for 8 nights on network TV, lengthy episodes, and the final episode had viewer statistics. I looked up the more recent sort of Super Bowl statistics just to kind of compare the numbers I was dealing with in the 1970s, and 130 million just in the USA watching this final episode. And I've also talked to folks who were born long after that night in January 1977, born 10, 20 years later, who caught up with Roots on DVD, and I'm sure it's streaming. And I understand the History Channel's done a reboot of Roots in 2016, but that's basically what it is. And what does it have to do with the history of genealogy? Well, this is the first big entertainment, and I'm referring to both the book and the TV show, where genealogy is such a part of the plot. I should say big mass entertainment. I can point to books before Roots, of course, but it's the first sort of mass entertainment where we see that. So it's a thrilling antecedent to all those genealogy reality shows that we've had in the last few decades. And there are all sorts of things Alex Haley said about the individual and their emotions when it comes to discovering ancestry that were absolutely inspirational to all those subsequent businesses. I do a lot with business history in this book. So think about business and entertainment and so forth. Now, what could this story of Roots have to do with the politics of genealogy in the sense of these social hierarchies that I just referred to? To make a long story short, Alex Haley, this is really complicated in African American history at this time, 1960s and 70s, but he self-identified as a conservative. He very much adhered, like I say, to even when he talked about really big social problems and brutalities on the plantation. And he's very explicit about enslavement being a brutal institution. Even at the same time, he just had a lot to say about emotions. And at least in the 1977 show, he carefully stayed away from times in history that would have overlapped with his audience. He was careful not to point fingers at modern day white people. And time and time again, I must say the audience that viewed that final episode, there are all sorts of, group sort of social breakdowns of it. People were curious about just who was watching that night. And it seems like there was a slight underrepresentation of African Americans who made up 12% of the population at that time, 1977 in the USA. 10% of the viewing audience for Roots was African American at that time. And I'm only taking into account that night. There's so much to say about people who saw it later. But my point being, Roots had this way of speaking, well, some would say universally, to many people who were not personally African American. And I could have more to say about sort of continuities in the history of genealogy and hierarchies, but I want to give Matt a chance for a follow-up question, if he wishes, or the next
Well,
question.
well, sure, absolutely. I mean, I'll, just a personal note. I mean, Roots was my first introduction to genealogy, and I'm not going to give my age away, but I did watch it on TV, so I can speak to what a profound and amazing event it was, and a little bit unlike today when we have so many channels. It was must see TV for sure. Um, and in your book, you also talk about some of the transformative effects in many ways that Roots had, and certainly it had a big effect here at the Newberry. You noted from a study that we had published that almost 60% of genealogy patrons at the Newberry in 1981 reported having begun their research since Roots aired, so in that 4-ish year period. I also know, just from my position, that's when the Newberry really began a concerted effort to build our African American genealogy collection and resources, and a commitment and an effort that is ongoing, that we still continue today, along with many of the other groups that were traditionally excluded from genealogy's mainstream. I'm going to switch gears just slightly, and because you talk about this, you just sort of alluded to it, but with the entertainment, genealogy as entertainment, and you mentioned that kind of as part and parcel in the book, along with this other aspect of genealogy's history, which is genealogy for profit and genealogy for hire. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about commercialized genealogy, past and present, and what does anti-commercial, nonprofit genealogy look like too?
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to start from early times. For much of the history of genealogy for hire, and I can confidently begin it before the Civil War. In this country, we're talking about one-person and two-person businesses. We're talking about people who hire themselves out to perform genealogy research. And there's hierarchies within that. There are people who hire themselves out specifically as record searchers and things like this. Okay, so until the 1920s or so, we're talking about, like I say, one-person businesses typically selling products such as blank family tree charts and blank forms where you can write down your information and things like this. And then we move forward into larger and larger businesses in the 20th century. Here in Chicago, we have a very interesting German-born businessman who worked for Who's Who. Frederick used to be Albert Verkus, but he changed his own name to Frederick Adams Verkus for a reason. Okay, he developed the first ever clearinghouse for genealogy information, which a clearinghouse can be extremely useful if you're yourself are practicing a genealogist or you know somebody who is, right? So he started the first sort of information collection exchange process of its kind, more than 1,500 subscribers. After 1945, we have a Mormon family, the Everton family out in Logan, Utah, who launched a periodical, a mass interest periodical, helping more people do more genealogy, they said. The periodical is called the Genealogical Helper, and it endured until the recession year, 2009, by which time it was getting some competition, presumably from Ancestry.com and the like. But it's many generations of this family and this periodical in popularizing genealogy, making it as sort of easy as possible and as pleasing as possible, fitting values and priorities of the descendant was very characteristic of commercial genealogy. And another immediate thing I reach for when I'm trying to represent commercialized genealogy is the traffic in heraldry, if you will. I know traffic is kind of a harsh word. We think of like drug traffickers and stuff, but even to this day, because American law doesn't place any obligations on an act of claiming ownership or family ties to a family crest, unlike in Britain, where the name and the crest pass from individual man to individual man through the generations. In the US, we have no such rules. Nothing stopping you to this day from going online and finding a surname that, I don't know if you even have to find it in your family tree that happens to match one of an aristocratic family outside the USA. And you can purchase a nice sort of framed version or jewelry or something like this, or there's probably a way you can do this online. Okay, so it's have to do with commercialism. Once again, it's about pleasing the customer. And I must say, it's about appealing to emotions. People get really emotional about heraldry, for sure, in a lot of ways. Okay, what does anti-commercialism look like within genealogy as businesses expanded? And a big pivotal decade for that is the 1930s, as there was an increasing market for hobbyists. And of course, genealogy is both a career and a hobby and stuff. Okay, so 1930s, lots of businesses to talk about, lots of commercially published guides to genealogy and instructions to genealogy to talk about, lots of scams. Okay, so you have a group of very scholarly people who are all at the 1940 meeting of the American Historical Association, who get together and develop the first ever organization of what I'm going to call professional genealogy. Professional doesn't mean always that you're a career genealogist, but it does mean a particular ethos of doing history for its own sake, finding all the apples in a client's family tree, even the apples that were rotten. And I'm stealing that metaphor from a real founding figure in professional genealogy. That would be Donald Jacobus, Jacobus, if you're familiar with that. Just the other day, I was flipping through a 2020 issue of the Register of the New England Historic Genealogical Society's periodical, and I found a review referring to the Jacobus Revolution. In the 1920s and 30s, by which he meant professionalism. So professionalism, their big foremost sort of value is accuracy. And I mean, it sounds very controversial, but like I say, they stick to the original records. They really distrust secondary sources or published family genealogies for the most part, published work already in modern times, because it can replicate mistakes and, basically focus on the descendant, which is not what they want to do. They want us to think about history for its own sake and empathize, you might say, in a big way with past generations, whether it violates our current values as descendants or not. All right, so this is what anti-commercialism looks like, and professionals keep doing outcries. Like the heraldry reform is a big value of theirs. Like for them, it's not impossible to have an American with royals in their ancestry, but what they're calling for is proof, not the kind of family tree that goes back, and this is not a joke, I've seen it myself too. I believe Odin is some kind of Viking god, and Odin, Odin, I believe is the English spelling, and can end up at the kind of top or bottom of quite a few family trees that are more sort of fantastical. So anyhow, commercialized genealogy, the descendant is the customer who must be pleased. You're a good business person in doing that. Anti-commercial genealogy, you and the professional genealogist you work with, or maybe that's you're there to learn about history. So, and there's some gray areas in between, but yeah.
Well, absolutely. I know that the anti-commercial, quote unquote, professionalized genealogy, there's associations, there's certification, that sort of thing. And there are definitely some tensions, right, between them and this genealogy that's focused on the descendants' kind of emotional satisfaction.
That's right. And professionals, another thing they're about is that they say, and past and present, is genealogy cannot be self-taught, right? They specialize in advice books. They specialize in instructions, how to, not for the beginner necessarily, but for the genealogist who's already been doing it, right? We have to reform the practice in the direction of sticking to the records. Oh yes, and there's truth to be found out there in the archive, in the printed archive, there is no doubt. So I just wanted to point that out. They knew, and this is generally true of genealogy, that the people who sort of come and go as hobbyists within the history of genealogy, who kind of do it and then move on to something else, and it's very much of a side interest, or it's something you do in your leisure time. They know there's that whole world out there, right? And that's who they're trying to reach, and they keep on being frustrated. And this is still going on, of course. I have to say the same old things about heraldry and stuff to this day. Yeah, the story doesn't end so far.
Very, very true. Very true. Very true. Well, I want to ask you about something else that's definitely a through line in your book, and you just kind of introduced it when you mentioned Everton, and that's the Mormon Church. And your book, as you state, is the first to bring together the history of Mormon genealogy with histories of non-Mormon genealogy to kind of situate them side by side. So help us understand what distinguishes Mormon from non-Mormon forms of genealogy.
Okay, I'm going to give you as quick an overview as I can. Pardon me. And throughout the decades I'm going to mention, I very much researched whatever the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was prescribing. And I also did what I could to reconstruct the views of lay people, which sometimes would follow church prescriptions and sometimes not. Okay, so the commitment, the spiritual and religious commitment to the dead is characteristic of Mormonism from very early days. Multiple declarations and revelations from the church's founder, Joseph Smith, at the time that he lived. And so between the roughly 1830s and 1890s, you have development and elaboration of an important ritual. They use the word ordinance, called baptism for the dead, where a living person stands in or represents a person who has died, typically from their family, not always in these decades, but I would say most of the time, from their family. And the idea here is to approach the dead person where they are in the afterlife with the gospel, they say. With the opportunity to convert to Mormonism. Now, there is no claim here to know the response of the dead person, or whether they indeed were in the afterlife, whether they do convert. There's nothing like this. They're not spiritualists. However, it's incumbent upon the living to approach the dead in this way. This is part of a process that has many parts of getting to heaven. And then there are many layers of heaven to talk about. Well, what changes in the 1890s is that the church, exactly simultaneously as it gives up polygamy and repudiates polygamy, that would be plural marriage and plural wives, at the very same time, it starts to develop its genealogical apparatus. We have an internal genealogical society developed by people who know full well about the the genealogy cultures that have been in development in other parts of the country, in New England since the 1840s. They know all about it. They go to New England on their own roots trips. They're inspired by that. They develop these institutions in Utah, and embedded within that is an especially active culture of teaching beginners developed by women, in particular by this one leading woman who is a daughter of Brigham Young, second church president. This would be Susa Young Gates, who publishes the first ever manual, really for beginners. She really does take beginners into account. This was not an effort at reform. And so it goes on from there. And in my book, I track the church's commitment to genealogy through all its phases as the gospel of the dead became all the more important. And I can talk a little more about that. We go from what's called the Temple Index Bureau from the 1920s, which is millions of index cards transcribed by workers who are mostly women, typing away, containing, for this baptism for the dead ritual ordinance that's done in temples. Pardon me, I should mention this before. You need the birth and the birth date and the death date, and as much genealogical data on the dead person that you are baptizing that you can get hold of. So your typical card in the temple index has that information, the birth date, the death date, the places, the marriages, and also the temple work that has been done by the person's descendants, right? It should show on this card whether the person has already been baptized while dead or not. So we go from this huge amount of index cards to moving the information onto microfilm and continuing to add to it. And I can go on into the era of the internet and the place where the microfilm negatives are stored in the side of a canyon, but you can read about it in my book to be sure. So over time, among all the other very important changes in Mormonism, there's no doubt that the church's commitment to the dead, expressed in this explicit commitment to fostering more genealogy among more people and reaching new audiences all the time, becomes more and more important theologically. And what does this have to do with the rest of American history when it comes to genealogy? Well, starting in the 1940s, instead of Mormon missionaries going east and, diving into the genealogy cultures there in the eastern cities and then to the Newberry Library and places like it, you still have that. But in the 1940s, when the church opens up its collections in a new way, you start to have people coming west, people going behind the mountain curtain, as there's a scholar, Janet Ships, who first used that metaphor for non-Mormons going to the Mormon heartland, So we have more and more genealogy tourism and travel and pilgrimage to talk about, including by groups. I do a lot with American Jewish genealogy in the book. And one thing I really noticed in the 1980s, and this is just an example of one group, repeated trips organized by the major Jewish genealogy journal to go out to Utah and mine all those sources in the church's International Genealogy Index for whatever they can get of forebears in Europe and also in the Americas. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's a lot. It's a long, rich history, and it's absolutely fascinating. I'm delighted you mentioned Susie Young Gates. One of the great things you do in your book is personalize this history, and she's absolutely fascinating. And I think her story and her history of rising to the position that she did in the church, and then it really kind of illustrates some of the gendering that happened in genealogy as well, where it was women's work for a long time until, at least in the church's case, there were other overriding church interests to.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes, to this day, the priesthood, and within Mormonism, that's a very broad term. Pretty much any right-thinking, right-acting man or boy who's older than 12 can become some other kind of priest. So around about the 1920s and 30s, as Susie Young Gates started to age, genealogy instruction gradually becomes something done by and for the priesthood. And people like Susie Young Gates were perfectly free to instruct other women, but it's more controversial when they instruct men. And the kinds of people doing priesthood instruction, who are priests themselves, had to be men. So we do have this transition as genealogy becomes more important to the church. It becomes, there's this new eagerness to reach male audiences, and obviously reaching the priesthood and making it all part of the process. And I can go ahead, Matt. I'm ready. I can.
No, I was just thinking what.
Talk on and on.
I was just thinking what a wonderful illustration of the value of situating the history of genealogy writ large alongside the history of Mormon genealogy, right? Because that gendering that we're talking about existed, as you just described, in the church, but we see evidence of that through in the larger genealogical landscape around the same time as well. So read the book.
Throughout. throughout time.
And
Yes.
throughout time, of
The time
course.
span I covered.
But
Yeah.
absolutely. But in fact, in the Newberry's history, the early curators were all women. Curators of genealogy were all women. So, so a little bit of interesting, a lot of interesting things there. So, so I want to shift gears again and just make sure we have time to fit this in. And this is a little bit of a self-interested question maybe, but I hope the audience would be interested. We know, and you state in the book, that you did a fair amount of your research for the book at the Newberry. You've been a Newberry Scholar in residence here for many years. So I'm just curious, do you have any great research finds, or can you tell any good research stories about discoveries in our collection here?
Absolutely. Well, you all have, first off, full runs of periodicals that exist only on paper and typically do not have indexes. And I'm a lucky person. I had time to browse them. So I browsed all the years, 70 plus, of the genealogical helper. You all have that. That would be the periodical run by the Everton family. A genealogy business of unprecedented size, done out of, I would say, a Mormon commitment out of Utah. So you have that. You also had full runs of the two major Jewish genealogy periodicals of the United States so far. I'm going to mispronounce this name, and I apologize. Toledot, which I understand is Hebrew for descendants, marked the beginning of institutional commitments to American Jewish genealogy. It was part of the scenario where right after Roots and the founders of these Jewish genealogy societies invoked Roots directly when they were talking about their reason for being. Anyhow, so you've got that early periodical, and you've got Avutenu later, which is still going from the 1980s onwards. So I looked at full sets. You have some wonderful holdings for indigenous genealogy, Native Americans doing genealogy. And I talk in the book, and this is part of a much broader phenomenon. Much more work needs to be done. I've only scratched the surface, really, in so many ways, with more than 500 tribes acknowledged these days. Okay, point being, the Newberry has a very rare periodical started in the around 1980 by a man in Oklahoma, Larry Sullivan Watson, whose big interest was in the 5 tribes. Back then, he made reference to the 5 civilized tribes. That would be the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Creek, Seminole. I'm blanking on the 5th one. But the journal is called the Journal of American Indian Family Research. And you browse it and you learn all about not just the emerging commitments, but all the layers of indigenous people's genealogy practice through book reviews and things. Larry Watson, and he never identified his own tribe. I have no idea about his own indigenous self-identification if he had one, but he was all about mining the National Archives in particular, and archives of any sort, for information about Native Americans. And there's this broader history of these tribal rolls that were developed around the time of the Dawes Act, which, in a sentence, was all about a punishing form of assimilation in those boarding schools you've probably heard about. But another thing happened with the Dawes Act were these land records, these allotment records containing the names of individual families. Well, there's this broader picture of indigenous genealogists in the 1970s and 80s and beyond, taking these records and using them as evidence for their own family research. So I'm learning all about that through the Newberry. And then there's things in your special collections that I also went to. In the 1980s, like Matt mentioned, you had particular librarians here. I don't have to remind you that Chicago's a segregated city, and I come from another one, Boston. I'm not here to single out Chicago, but there was this real awareness of trying to expand African-American use of the Newberry Library and reaching out to the community of African-American genealogists generally. within Chicago and elsewhere. So the library went about collecting particular microfilms, including of the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau right after the Civil War, and other things that were heavily used by African American genealogists. So that this one who later wrote a how-to guide for African American genealogy, went out obtaining this grant money, and they hired this woman by and herself was a published African American. She published for African American genealogists. I'm sorry if you can't hear me. I'm getting a note that my internet connection is a little weird. I can say more later. But anyhow, yeah, there's this point in history where the Newberry's very much looking for new audiences and meeting them where they are. So those are some of the highlights.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful to hear. Of course, it's something we can continue to try to grow and to build our collections on. And absolutely, I'm glad you've been able to make really good use of it, and hope more people do, of course. So that's fantastic. So we got a few more minutes before the Q&A. So let's get to the topic du jour on many genealogists and the general public's mind as well, and that is DNA testing. And I'm wondering if you can tell us some of the benefits of DNA testing and analysis, and maybe some of the harms of DNA testing and analysis to the field of genealogy.
And Murray have the emergence of the uses of DNA analysis for genealogy. So it's all in the last 20 years. And to make a long story short, DNA research of the kind of thing that you get nowadays when you take a DNA test and you get those percentages back. DNA testing of that sort, and then the other kind that we associate often with paternity, where close relatives, people sort of test each other and this as individuals to get a sense of biological relatedness between individuals. So you have both these kinds, and both these kinds are very important for particular forms of genealogy where the paper trail has ended or there's gaps in documentation. Now, I know that's the case with almost all genealogists. They bump into the end of a paper trail, even within demographics that are well documented. Well, for African Americans, generally, when Alex Haley made that claim about Kunti Kinte, his ancestor 7 generations back who had known Africa, it was considered nearly impossible at that time to fully document through births and marriages and all sorts of things, through all those decades of slavery, enslavement. And I talk more about that in my book, why that's the case. But even to this day, in modern times, African Americans refer to the 1870 federal census, which is the earliest federal census done after slavery was outlawed, as the brick wall, because it's so hard to document back of there. If you have enslaved people in your ancestry, and even if you have free Blacks, non-enslaved people in your ancestry. So DNA evidence is important for groups of people who have, I would say, particular historical reasons why in this broad way they're excluded from the archive. You know what I mean? Documentation is itself political. It expresses group hierarchies if your ancestor was documented, and if you yourself can document things, if you're in a position to do that. DNA testing also gets, and from very early times, 2002, I found articles in Avutenu, the Jewish genealogy journal in the United States, discussing the usefulness of DNA testing for these situations where there's document destruction and the village being in 3 different countries within 50 years, even though the village doesn't move. Okay, the harms of DNA testing, what could they be? What could be wrong? Well, one thing I'm just really broadly concerned about is that people who already believed that biological relatedness was the most legitimate form of a family tie. People who already have these settled beliefs about group identity, even though the DNA science makes nonsense of these various kinds of group identities among humans. And I'm thinking about races, I'm thinking about continents, I'm thinking about ethnicity in particular. Even though the science makes nonsense out of them, there's just no doubt, according to these various sociological surveys that have been done in the past few years, that for many people, DNA testing reinforces group identity, including that of race, in this very indelible way. You know, we're talking about a characteristic of the body, whatever is in your DNA that gets read in a lab and compared to an unspecified population. So it's this bodily type thing that you can't really undo. So I end the book on a somewhat pessimistic note, but I want my book to be the beginning of a conversation, not to be the last word. So I'm looking for eventually someone to revise what I say in a more optimistic direction. And there's more to say about both benefits and harms.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So you also bring in your book recent LGBTQ plus history. And I'm just curious, can you describe further the meanings of genealogy in that history and your characterization of particular forms of family building as queer?
Well, there's a wonderful anthropological study of 1980 San Francisco called Families We Choose. The author is Kath Weston. I have not looked up where she is now, but you know, she's a working anthropologist with an academic post. And the reason why I'm discussing this book is that within this, okay, when I talk about queer history, I talk about people who declare themselves family. We are family in disregard of blood and biological ties that are so incredibly important and getting all the more important and valued among people who did not identify as queer. And there's a whole range within this. You know, I have particular individuals who simultaneously identify as gay or lesbian, who place great value also in their blood relatives. But Kath Weston in particular researched these webs in San Francisco. They weren't always based on couples, you know. A lot, sometimes it was ex-boyfriends or exes, you know, at the center of them, but people who acted as family to each other. And so to this day, we have what's called the found family, which people create these family bonds online, as well as in person, again, in disregard of ties of biology and blood. And we have these particular sort of declarations, I would say liberationist statements about kind of getting away from this sort of bind of biology. And so that's what I see when I see queer genealogy. And I've got, there are various kinds of queer studies sources that would back up this view. And when I was researching this project, I met someone in their 20s who had met online a 17-year-old person who had been kicked out of their house by their parents specifically for being LGBTQ. And so this person in their 20s adopted this teenager, and very much considered, those two people very much consider themselves a found family. And that's the first place I heard of the found families happening online, you know? So this is a developing story.
It's just, yeah, that's really fascinating. And it brings to mind someone else someone else's story you tell in the book, who she was queer, although I don't know if that was the word she would have used. But could you spend a minute just telling us a little bit about Polly Murray and
Absolutely.
why you tell her story and what's her connection here.
Yes, there's some wonderful biographies of Polly Murray that have just come out, and indeed she's embraced as an example of someone genderqueer in history by modern day scholars in queer studies. Why is that? It's because she was born with the name Anna Pauline Murray, but she took on the name Pauli, Pauli, as an adult, and here and there traveled openly, wearing men's suiting, if you will. You know, she reached out, sort of explored changing to a man, but then for various reasons backed away from it, and she was incredibly alone in this process. And there's surviving correspondence from young Polly Murray all about this, and her biographers have done a great job with this part of her life. Well, I'm talking, and she has tremendous significance to the history of feminism, what we might call the second wave. And so forth, and also to civil rights. There's particular things that she did with the 14th Amendment that matter to the NAACP lawyers arguing Brown v. Board of Education. So there's a lot of other things to say, but what I say about Polly Murray is that in the 1950s, when she was middle-aged and back to being she, and dressing as a woman and so forth, she published Proud Shoes among her many books, and Proud Shoes was, I would say, roots before roots. Like Alex Haley's story of Kunta Kinte, we're talking about a family tree of many generations reaching back to enslaved people and reaching back to free Blacks who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries, mostly in Pennsylvania and Delaware. Also free people of color. Tracking this family history all the way down to the present. So Proud Shoes was published in 1956, and I argue that it's an important and often unacknowledged antecedent for roots, even though Polly Murray and Alex Haley had very different purposes and were reaching for different audiences and so forth. So it's a real milestone in African-American genealogy, and in her practice of genealogy, she anticipates a lot of things to come. She helps prepare the ground on which Alex Haley came up with his own research on Kunta Kinte those years later. And for those of you who don't know, she lived in a relatively closeted, quiet relationship with another woman, and they stayed together until her partner died. But this would be in the 1950s, 60s, and her partner died in 1973. So quite early times for a same gender couple. So.
Yeah, and I would just a little plug here, let folks know we have Proud Shoes here in the collection at the Newberry. So come check it out. And well, thank you, Francesca. And let's make sure we have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to turn here to some of the questions that were submitted. So this is a little bit of a long one, but I'm going to read this. Milan Kundera, in his Unbearable Lightness of Being, talks about the role of nostalgia, which makes even the most heinous acts lose their sting if committed long ago enough. He uses the example of Robespierre returning every 30 years to chop off more heads. Instead of chuckling about that rascal, we would be horrified. My question: why do people become so invested in sanitizing their ancient family history via genealogy, even to the extent of erasing or ignoring very old transgressions?
Right. Well, the way I'd answer your question is to point to the more commercialized forms of genealogy that I would say, put it this way, are a lot easier to find, especially for the casual hobbyist or the person who steps in and out or who does it sort of at home or on the side. The way the professionals operate, the anti-commercial, which the professionals make a point, like I say, of not apologizing for finding the rotten apples in your family tree. You kind of have to know what you're looking for. It's like the club that doesn't have a sign outside that you kind of know that you know it if you know the people. I can give you some names and journals for this more unvarnished approach where people make a point of taking what there is from the past. Donald Jacobus, for himself, talked about axe murders happening between this one brother and sister in a white family of colonial Connecticut that eugenics advocates at the time treasured. This is in the 1920s. So axe murder, not quite Robespierre or exaggerations of Robespierre, but you get the picture. So I know exactly why this happens, frankly. Nostalgia is, of course, views of the past done for the priorities and the usefulness to present generations. So, of course, it's processed. Historians, on the other hand, they strive as much as they can for, and I'm going to use a buzzword for my own profession, empathy. Trying to get the perspective of history where you not only don't know what's happening next, but you get everything. So all I can tell the questioner is strive. And if you email me, I can give you some names and links for, I would call them professionals of the more unvarnished kind of genealogy practice, if that's something you're looking for.
Right, I agree, and I would posit that the Newberry could help in that regard as well.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah.
So
I should have had you address the question. That's
no, your answer is fantastic. Thank you. Okay, here's a follow-up question. You mentioned the novel Families We Choose in reference to families formed between LGBTQ plus individuals. But is there anything you can elaborate on in regards to families formed by adoption and their genealogy?
Of course. I must clarify that Families We Choose is a nonfiction work. Again, it's an anthropological study. But more to your question, yes, this we just got out of many decades of adoptions being conducted among strangers with the use of paid adoption agencies, often, but not always, entailing destruction or concealment or alteration of the original birth certificate of the adopted baby. This all got going around World War II. It was not the case in earlier American history so much, where adoptions were informal and done among people who knew each other or even family to each other, kids going to live with their grandparents and stuff like that. Okay, my point being, from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, where you had these closed adoptions, the adult children, many of them started protesting and mobilizing in adoptee organizations, and they're very much part of genealogy because for these particular reasons having to do with document destruction at a time where the birth certificate in particular acquires all the more importance. You can imagine what that means in this modern times of real ID. These people I'm going to call adoptees, adult adoptees, they're protesting 40 years ago and now. And this conversation goes on, and it's a really important moment in the history of genealogy because a lot of these adoptee organizations, because they live without, or they perceive themselves to lack this kind of knowledge, in particular of their biological relations or their genetic relations. And I don't need to tell you about the rise of genetics importance to medicine and things like that. There's that kind of information they lack. So they've done a lot to affirm what I see as a real American predilection to value, in particular, blood forms of relatedness and biological relatedness, because I'm not adopted myself, but I would imagine if I were, I'd be surrounded all the time by reminders of why I should care about genetics. Of course, these reality shows and things about genealogy. So that's a short answer I would give. I do quite a bit with adoption in the final chapters of my book.
And I'll just say too that it's very, very much the case that adoption research is part of genealogy and family history questing. We field many questions from not just adoptees, but also birth parents searching for their children here. And so it's very much tied in with everything that you've said here. So here's a question that I warrant has may be asked by a current genealogy practitioner, but I'll go ahead and read this here. Has Dr. Morgan researched her own family genealogy? And if so, how many generations has she found?
Oh, sweet. Okay, if you're if you're ready for this. I have not personally done research because my mother, frankly, she passed away just a few months ago, but she's simultaneously, thank you, a published historian, an amazing artist, I must say, and a very active genealogist for decades. And she documented us to a T. She documented us very carefully. She got us back to 16th century England on both sides of the family. There's a particular point, I believe, during Henry VIII's reign where the Church of England orders parishes to start keeping more systematic records of baptism and things like this. And so she got us back there, and she got us, she bridged all the links through early colonial, a couple of, at least one Mayflower passenger to talk about. I could name check some revolutionary figures as well. So I joke with my students, I've got ancestors on both sides of the American Revolution. I've got ancestors on both sides of the Civil War. No wonder I'm indecisive. So yeah, and if you look at my, I made a little mistake referring to our Y chromosome test, my introduction. It'll be corrected in the second run of the book. But however, my point being, I put my own pie chart in there when I got a DNA test done. I did it on a lark when Ancestry.com was having a sale in 2017. And this particular test of my DNA showed me 91% English and Welsh. But then a few years later, I got an email from Ancestry saying that a greater fraction of Irishness had been found. So, yes. So, there's a little slice of, the suggestions from my DNA test combined with all the documentation that my mother and people further back in my family have done.
Fantastic. Did those results mostly corroborate what you expected?
Yes. I was a little surprised at the Irishness, but I assume there's a long history of even before the Scots-Irish and the colonization, but Irish making their way to England and Wales and intermarrying further back. But I do more modern history than I do early modern, so I'll have to sort of leave it there about why. Irishness is one thing I didn't hear much from her, except for Scots-Irish in the United States who are sort of ethnically Scottish and, obviously Presbyterian, whatnot, kind of marrying. And it was those kinds of Irish I was aware of, not the sort of ethnically Irish. That's a long story. Yeah, there's never a short answer to a question.
Absolutely. Well,
I dedicate this book to my mother and her memory for a reason. So. And I dedicated it to her before she passed. She had a nice long life. She was 81.
Well, she clearly gave you a lot, and that's a lovely sentiment. And I think we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Francesca, for sharing so much, for a wonderful conversation this evening. Your book is a welcome and major contribution to the field. It's a delight to read, and even more fun to get to discuss it with you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Recording of this program is available on the Newberry's YouTube channel and Facebook page.